All right, good evening. It's so great to see all of you here tonight. It's kind of bittersweet moment here putting this mic on because I've been hearing the comments that Taylor makes about somebody's head size, and I don't get to hear that. But of course, it's sweet why he's not here, and I'm sure you all join me in praying to God, giving him thanks for the new baby boys that we have to celebrate tonight. God truly is a great and awesome God. Tonight, we're going to continue our study on the sins of the tongue, specifically the idea of caustic speech and words that stir up wrath. The Bible has a lot to say about these like harsh or corrosive words and our speech in general, as we're coming to find out as we study this quarter. So we're just going to jump right into this and go over a few key scriptures. There's some verses that we're all going to be familiar with by now. They've all come up multiple times through our study on the sins of the tongue. But I want to take some ideas from that and have them fresh in our minds as we advance through this idea of studying on caustic speech. I've asked some volunteers to help us out with these verses. The first one's Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. I'm sorry that text is small there. Y'all can yell at me later for that. Proverbs 15, verse 1. Who had that one? Brother Nelson.
A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up.
Thank you, brother. All right, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. Whoever had that, just go ahead and read it out loud for us, please.
Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up, according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Next one is James chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. James chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. This reads, "Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile, creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so." Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6.
Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate that. And our last one, Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 through 37.
But I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned.
Thank you, brother. Okay, so as I said, these are all verses that we have looked at several times throughout the course of our study. We will reference them again tonight as we go through our understanding of caustic speech. They're all things to keep in mind as we move into our study. So I think it's also good for us to have a good reminder of that first lesson that we had in this study, and that is just to consider just how powerful the tongue is. If you will recall, in that first week, we spent a lot of time in James chapter 3. We went over the idea of how the tongue is such a small thing, and yet it can have such a profound impact in our lives. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." Our speech, the things that we can say, that has the power to build people up, to tear people down, to build strong relationships, or to completely destroy what once were strong relationships. We've all heard the saying about sticks and stones that break my bones, right? But I think that words truly can have a much greater impact, I think, than we tend to attribute to it. I'd like for you to raise your hand with me tonight if you have ever been on the receiving end of some sort of physical altercation. Somebody hit you, they pushed you in a fight, wrestling around. Maybe you can remember like a particularly bad spanking you got from your parents when you were a kid, something like that, right? Anything like that, any kind of physical hurt that you have received, right? You raise your hand. Now I want you to keep your hand up if today in this moment you still feel the pain that was inflicted on you in that moment that you were thinking of. That's okay, right? Now, again, raise your hand if you have ever in your life been the recipient or victim of a verbal or emotional abuse, right? Somebody had said something that just cut you deep, that hurt you bad, and you remember this particular moment that had an impact, right? I want you to leave your hand up if in this moment, as you recall that scenario, if those words still have some bite to them, if it still hurts you a little bit to think about. I can definitely say that. Right? And this is a thing that I like to do to raise awareness of that, right? So physical pain may hurt pretty bad in the moment. You're not going to feel it a few weeks later. I've been punched in the face a lot as an adult, unfortunately. I don't feel any of those moments now. But there are plenty of times where I've had some really harsh words exchanged between me and loved ones. Those things still carry a lot of hurt today. Right? These things can have a lasting impact on us. So let's take a look specifically about this idea of caustic speech and how much of an impact it can have. Just what is caustic speech? What do we mean when we say that? I don't know if caustic is necessarily a word that shows up in our day-to-day speech. I don't want to do that yet. If you looked at the Webster's dictionary for it, right, it would say that caustic means capable of destroying or eating away, like by a chemical action or marked by incisive sarcasm. But of course, we're not here to study Webster's dictionary tonight, right? So if I were to give you a definition that was based on what we read in Scripture, then I would have to say that caustic speech is speech that it's harsh, it's biting, or corrosive in tone, and that it's intended to hurt, divide, or infuriate. Or even if it wasn't necessarily intended to, it's speech that resulted in somebody being hurt, or a relationship being split apart, or negative emotions arising in the person who received those words. There's a couple of good proverbs that speak about this. The first one is Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18, if you would turn there with me. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18. Reads, "There is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health." You ever been on the receiving end of some words that really cut deep like a sword, right? That just pierce through your heart like that? I think that if you can recall a kind of moment like that, and you would agree with me that this analogy is a pretty apt description of what those words can have, right? They can pierce like a sword. And Proverbs 15:1 is a verse that the brother just read, that a soft anger turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Harsh words stir up anger. A lot of times, it may not even necessarily be what is said, but how it is said. There's some kind of tone or inflection or inference that's put on a word that can really stir up some negative emotions within us. In any case, I would say that there are definitely things that can be said, or ways that they can be said in a harsh way, that inevitably will stir up a feeling of anger, even in the best of us. And this is what we're talking about with this idea of caustic speech. What motivates somebody to speak like this? Why would somebody want to use this harsh, biting tone with somebody when they speak to them? What kind of scenarios, what kind of things bring this up in somebody that they would want to speak like that? Ryan? Anger? Just simple anger, right? Like they're just angry and they just want to lash out. Okay? It's simple enough. Make them hurt. Okay, so somebody hurt me, I want to hurt you back. Perfect, like Brother Tim, too. Yeah.
So we feel like we've been treated unjustly, and so we adjust.
The bruised ego, right? How's it go? Okay. Jealousy, absolutely. Brother Tim?
Just the power of knowing that you're going to get to that person.
Okay, so it might give you some kind of sway over another individual, right? And you exercise that. Anybody over here? Ben?
Being guilty, trying to protect yourself.
Okay, and the feeling of guilt, and you got to maybe pawn that guilt off on somebody else, right, Brother Kyle?
Thinking about the Pharisees and the fear that they felt as they saw Jesus getting attention and their efforts they made to destroy him with their speech because of their fear of losing their own place of prominence.
Right. I'm glad that you brought that up because we're definitely going to study a couple examples of that later, and you're absolutely right. It definitely played a big part in what motivated the Pharisees to speak to Jesus and about Jesus in the way that they did, right? Brother Stephen?
Someone may want to use this kind of speech to instill fear in another person, possibly manipulate them or control them in some way, particularly in closer relationships that are unhealthy. This happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. Absolutely. So you guys came up with the same kind of things that I did when I thought about this idea, right? That these words are often fueled by, it's a pride problem, a bruised ego, feelings of anger, maybe feelings of fear or insecurity. My standing, my place is somehow being threatened and I need to lash out at somebody. And we do have a couple of biblical examples of this. The first one that comes to mind for me is the book of Job. All right, you guys remember what happened to Job, what went on with him, and how his friends treated him, how his own wife treated him? What did she say? What did she tell him? There's a phrase that comes to mind often when we think of that. What did she tell him? Curse God and die. His own wife. There's the support that she got from him, right? In Job chapter 16, the first 5 verses here, this is the beginning of Job's response to a couple of his friends. I would love to spend some time to study everything that they said to him, but just there's so much, right? I can't imagine. These are supposed to be his closest allies, and he's going through the struggle of a lifetime. And here's the response that Job had to what his friends said to him. Chapter 16, verse 1. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall words of wind have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do, if your soul were in my soul's place. I could heap up words against you and shake my head at you, but I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips would relieve your grief. All right? His friends were not doing any of that for him at all, were they? As we said, his own wife didn't either. This idea of these caustic, these harsh words that they spoke to him, the man is in a very vulnerable position in his life, and instead of being built up by the people closest around him, they just attacked him in his moments of his most vulnerable moments, right? And that's really horrible to consider, but I know it happens. It definitely happens in real life as well. And the other example that I like to go to is the Pharisees and the blind man in John chapter 9. If you flip over there with me. So this is a blind man that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees really want to know why or how or what happened. If we pick up that story in verse 13, in John chapter 9, they brought to him formerly was blind, the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. And others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. And you'll recall as the story goes, they keep asking the man. They asked his parents. They told him, he's an adult, ask him. Right? If we skip down a few verses and pick up again in verse 26. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. You almost can't even read that verse without putting some kind of harsh tone to it, right? Continuing on. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, Why this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered to him, you were completely born in sins, and you're teaching us? And they cast him out. This is just one of many examples of the Pharisees using this harsh tone with somebody like this, right? And especially that last verse there, man. After everything, the testimony that this man gave of the miracle Jesus performed on him, they're like, who are you? You're full of your sins, man. They cast him out like that. Just that idea, that harsh, biting, caustic tone that they used with this man to put him out. There's just a couple biblical examples. There are more, but these are the two biggest ones, I think, that jumped out to me at first. But what does it look like today? How do people use caustic speech today? What does that look like? It's something that you can recall in recent memory in your own life, maybe, that you would attribute to somebody using this idea of caustic speech. Brother Kyle?
Public forum, we see it in politics all the time. People just ridiculing or calling people names just to really tear up their reputation and stuff.
Right, absolutely. I think that's definitely a good place to find some, right? Just watch any national debate around election time. We'll see it. That's a good point.
I mean, you're going to see it all over social media. You can just about put only an idiot would after any statement on social media because that's how people act on it. Like, they'll answer whatever question it is and then only an idiot would, you know, and it's like, really? That's the angle you thought would be best to go about this? So.
Right. It's horrible. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Behind closed doors, I would use it to get a reaction.
Okay. So you want to elicit a certain kind of response out of somebody? Okay. Anybody else have any comments? Any idea? Ryan?
I think just rudeness, like just daily interaction with someone at a fast food place, or whatever. Just your daily interaction, just
Absolutely.
rude people, or myself being rude to people, just because I'm having a bad day or whatever.
Right. Running late to work and somebody cuts you off. Whatever. Anything like that, right? People are just rude a lot of times. It's amazing how much traffic has the ability to pull that rudeness out of us, right? Brother Ben? Okay. In your marriage? Absolutely. You could have, get some kind of feelings hurt there with your spouse. You say some things out of that hurt, that position of hurt, to maybe bring them down to your level, something like that, right? Okay, absolutely. So this idea of caustic speech does happen today. We understand this, right? I like to take a look at some examples of how the Bible says that this manifests in our life. This idea of words that stir up wrath, like different categories, I guess, that we could classify these kinds of sayings under. Your lesson book, if you read through it, did this more or less. But as I read through it to prepare for this lesson, I was like, this is kind of just a review of the last 7 weeks, right? So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But it is important to kind of think of it in these terms, right? These are the different ways that this can manifest, even in our own mouths. The first of which is this idea of abusive speech. This is something that is definitely exemplified by the Pharisees, as we have said, and I want to look at a couple more examples of that. These are specifically the Pharisees, the things that they said of Jesus, or what Jesus himself said they said about him. John chapter 8, verse 48. It says, "And the Jews answered and said to him, 'Do we not say rightly that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?'" Was that something true of Jesus? Of course not, right? I mean, this idea. And then in Luke chapter 7, if you turn a few pages back to Luke chapter 7 and verse 33. This is Jesus speaking about what the Pharisees had said about him and John the Baptist. In verse 33 says, "For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." Like, there's just a couple examples of that, but this is abusive speech. And why? If for no other reason than to just try to cause harm or to cause some kind of damage to Jesus' reputation because they were feeling threatened. It was an ego problem, right? This idea of abusive speech, gossip and slander, of course, we studied this very extensively. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 28 says, "A perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends." This idea of cursing. James chapter 3 and verse 10 says, "Out of the same mouth proceed both blessing and cursing," as we read earlier. Or lying and flattery. We also just studied that recently. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 28 says, "A lying tongue hates those who are crushed by it, and a flattering mouth works ruin." And of course, this idea of complaining, I'm purposefully not looking at Amelia when I bring this one up. We talk about it a lot at work, it's funny. But complaining too, right, can be very caustic. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 5 through 10, speaking about the Israelites, but in verse 10 of them, he says, "Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer." I think if any singular group of people in the Bible exemplified this idea of complaining habitually, nobody beats the Israelites at that, right? Absolutely not. So just to bring all of these things to your mind, of course, we've studied these concepts throughout the weeks, but when we're talking about them in the context of this idea of words that can stir up wrath, I would like to ask you guys, how do you usually respond when somebody offends you? Somebody says something that offends you, that hurts your pride, that maybe makes you angry. How do you usually respond? What is normally the response that comes? Anybody? Yeah. No, I mean, either one.
It's taking a lot of work to respond to a general response is to try to stay calm and focus on the person's attitude and basically label that attitude in my mind so I know what it is, so I can process what's going on. And if it's something that's very, very stressful to me, or gets my heart rate going, or those kind of things, I would love to find out more about that. If it's something they're really accusing me of, I'd like to find out more about that. If it's someone who's just wanting to hurt me, I try to stay calm and just receive what I can, allow them to basically get it out. I mean, if I interrupt or whatever, it's just going to make it kind of escalate. So that we can become calm and then talk about it. And if there's sin, if it's a brother, I need to talk to them in private about them sinning against me in some way, if they were sinning against me in that. But I've got to control myself in that situation. I can't control them.
Right.
I can control that moment.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. And when I hear, if I were going to summarize that in my own words, I guess, staying calm and responding instead of reacting, right? Not letting the emotions dictate the situation and giving time for those to cool out before you responded, right? And wisdom being a good idea. I don't know that I necessarily do that every time, but I'd like to think that I could, right? Absolutely. Anybody else had a thought on that, Brother Zach?
Yeah, I look at words that stir up wrath as an invitation into the arena, basically. When you got somebody that is, it is provocation. That is what it is. That is the purpose of it.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think we're all thinking it, but I'll be the one to say it. We feel a sense of anger in return. Whenever someone is angry and they're saying something that is just inflammatory, it makes us angry. And I think that there's a fear to say that and acknowledge that it's like, yeah, I can feel anger. How we respond to that, though, I think is what Steve just absolutely nailed it by saying, hey, just because you're feeling angry does not mean you let that overrule you, which is exactly what you find in Genesis 3, or Genesis 4 rather. When Cain, he got really angry, his countenance falls, and God even says, why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, you can still be accepted. Sin is crouching at the door. It's ready for you, but you've got to rule over it. You've got to master it. But that is the response. It's that invitation into the arena that says, let's...
Right.
And you can see it in John 9 as well, where they're sitting there, they're saying caustic things to this guy, and he's like, oh, well, that's an amazing thing. How is it that we don't know where he's from? It healed me. It's like you can hear it back of
right.
Responds with anger, and so that's how we do too.
Absolutely, but that's the whole idea, right? Like you said, it's an invitation to the arena, but the whole point is there's that intention behind the thing. It's really Brother Ben mentioned it happening with our spouse. I think a lot of times that might be a good pitfall or a decent temptation for us to fall to that, right? Where we want them to be kind of suffering with us on that level a little bit. I'm not saying all the time, but there's definitely a temptation for that to be there, right? We open the door like that. But responding to that, absolutely, as we're going to get to later, is very, very critical. I saw a hand up in the back. Sorry.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that a lot of times we are able to control our response. If you think about how sometimes if your boss speaks to you a certain way at work, you don't respond in kind. You usually are more thoughtful and temper your response to your boss because you know what that kind of response might be. And I was thinking, what Ben said earlier about in our marriages, sometimes our words get stirred up towards one another because we realize that, well, I can say that to her, or she can say that to me, and we have this confidence that neither of us are going anywhere. And so sometimes we may not treat one another with the same kind of kindness and respect that we might treat our coworkers. And sometimes we can be guilty of the same thing within the church, of speaking to one another in that way, and that we tend to be one another's, we become critical of one another when we're supposed to be helping one another the most through life. So
Absolutely. Definitely excellent comment. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. There's another, okay, Brother Tim, and then I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So, I think sometimes we got to plan ahead, though, because once we get in the moment, we're going to mess things up. As we get closer to people, we're going to find out their buttons and know what to push, And I think sometimes we have to meditate on, okay, first you got to know yourself and know what your own buttons are so that you can recognize here it comes, right? And then just back up, be quick to hear, but slow to speak. But then knowing other people, you know what their buttons are too. You just got to play in your mind how you're going to react and also avoid at all costs going down that road towards something that you know is going to offend somebody or set them off. And even joking, right? You don't want to like hurt their feelings or set them off on accident. So you want to kind of steer away from those things that are their buttons.
Absolutely.
As someone who has genuinely made other people mad at me, when they respond in anger, always be willing to listen to the Malcolms of truth that will come from it and be ready to apologize. I had a client who yelled at me for 2.5 hours, right? And afterwards I sent a giant email out detailing everything that he talked about, because some things in there were genuine faults of mine and genuine faults of my employer. But in the end, that wasn't the right way to handle it. And when it was all said and done, I told him, hey bud, don't talk to me like that again, but I'm gonna try to do better. And my relationship with that took an entire 180, right? And this is of the world, of course. But now, you got people who request your assistance now because they know he'll actually listen to me. And then when he comes back again, he's not going to be that angry because he knows, hey, bud, you can't talk to me like that. This won't work if you do this. But when people come in anger and you respond with kindness, it immediately, not always, but it can evaporate pretty quickly. And always remember to be willing to apologize and be willing to be okay with saying, okay, this person is going to vent for me for a bit, like how Stephen said, but pull the truth from it. Try to make it better next time, but know that, sometimes there's a bit of truth in there.
Right, absolutely. And I think you raise a good point about this, like to keep in mind that the heart that said these things or that generated this caustic or harsh language is coming. It's the result of something, a bruised ego, right? A perceived infraction or something like that. To put yourself in their shoes for a moment, a little bit, exercise a little compassion in that situation if possible, right? Right, absolutely.
Everyone responds with anger. What is that going to do for that person when they go, what?
Right. So, I think that it's also important to consider what happens when we don't do that, right? So when we do find ourselves responding in anger, when we do find ourselves, if we take a look at the nature of our speech sometimes, and it is caustic, it is harsh, it is harmful, to really at that moment examine what it is that's going on in my mind, in my thought process, that's allowing those words to come out of me in the first place. This idea of the heart that goes behind the words, right? Jesus said in two different places, we're going to look at one of them, Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, and Luke 6. We're going to read Luke 6 here in a moment, if you want to turn there. They both say basically the same thing, but Jesus has something to say about the heart behind the words. Right here in Luke chapter 6, we're actually going to begin in verse 43. Jesus says, "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. If our words are harsh, especially if we notice a habitual pattern of harsh language coming out of our mouth, that language is a fruit. It came from something. It's not the problem. It's a symptom, right? The problem is something that's going on much deeper inside. It's something that I need to examine in my own heart, my own thought process, something I may be trapped in. Ephesians 4 has some things that are helpful for this. We read verse 29 earlier, but I'd like to read it in a little bit of a fuller context. If we turn over there, Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 29. Paul says, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good and for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Paul said to let all bitterness, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you. If we don't do that, if we're holding on to some lingering feelings of anger, of bitterness, if we find ourselves in the trap of keeping a tally of petty infractions that the people around us have done to us, maybe our coworkers or people that we love or close friends, then what we are doing is allowing that seed of bitterness to take root and potentially grow into something that I should not say. We had kind of already talked about this idea, but caustic words are the fruit, they're not the root. Right? That was a catchphrase earlier when I was talking with Nikki about this. She's like, oh, you got to bring that up. That's my thing. So we need to examine the root and not the fruit. If the fruit is bad, if I smell bad fruit, I need to go dig out the root and find out why it's bad. There's something going on in there. I need to have some internal inflection. I'm a child of God. Right? My root should not be bad. I need to go examine what I allowed to get in there. And if it is a conversation I need to have with somebody, if I do need to apologize for something, whether or not I even think it's wrong, right? If I need to exercise that same kind of compassion that God exercised with us when he forgives us in order to diffuse a situation or to let go of whatever that lingering negative emotion is in my mind, I need to do that. We need to do that quickly, I would say. And we've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but this idea of like, when do you find, you don't have to answer right now, maybe just in your own mind, but think about the time, when is it hardest for you to control what you say? It's going to be a different time for all of us, I think. For me, it's definitely when I brought up traffic for a reason. Driving in traffic is extremely stressful for me. That's the time when it's hardest for me. Okay, but it's going to be different for everyone. To identify that moment in your mind, and can you think back the last few times you found yourself in that time? What kind of thought process were you going through? Did you allow those feelings to fester in there long enough that you would succumb to a wrong way of thinking, maybe even a wrong way of speech, or something wrong to even do because of the result of letting those negative emotions stew in there, right? The heart behind the harsh words a lot of times has a lot of time to fester and to really come up with some really ugly things to say. What might your words reveal about what's going on in your heart in that situation? Are you still feeling that anger? Are you still feeling that insecurity? Maybe the bruised ego that we had talked about a moment ago. Any of those things, to me, it sounds like a pride of life problem. And as children of God, we should definitely be willing to try to work to root that out of us. But God doesn't just say to stop being harsh, right? He also gives us things to replace that harsh speech with. He gives us better things to say. We just read in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, to be kind to one another and tenderhearted and forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. If this was my primary motivation in having a conversation with somebody, how likely do you think that I would be to speak in a harsh way to them? It'd be pretty impossible, right? Harsh words or angry talk, as we have already commented on, they don't just come out of nowhere. They're usually as a result of somebody has done something to me or said something to me, or at least I perceived some kind of infraction from what they've done or said. And none of these things are spewing up as a response to that. But God doesn't do that to us. Thank goodness God doesn't do that to us. Right? God has forgiven us. God forgave me long before I ever did or said anything harmful to him. He doesn't hold on to those infractions. He doesn't have any kind of bitterness that he lets fester. Doesn't do things like that with us. And I'm glad that he doesn't, because I've definitely said and done some things that I really deeply regret. And I'm glad that God does not hold those things against me, that he has forgiven me, and that I won't have to face those things on the day of judgment. That's a powerful thing. But we should carry some of that into our day-to-day interactions with each other. Right? As children of God, we should be willing to extend that same kind of latitude towards each other. Right, to have that same kind of attitude of tenderheartedness and forgiveness when we have things that we want to say to people. And with that, there's some specific ideas that we can think about. And again, these are things that have already been gone over through our study this quarter, so we won't spend a lot of time on them. But if what you're about to say is not true, should we say it? Of course not, right? We're supposed to speak the truth. Ephesians 4:25, therefore putting away lying, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are all members of one another. I think that the golden rule also applies, right? It definitely applies to our speech. We should speak to other people how we would want them to speak to us. When we're considering this idea of caustic speech and of harsh words, and you remember how bad it felt to be on the receiving end of that, as a child of God, would I really want somebody else to have those same kind of feelings as a result of something that I said. Our work, one of the primary works of the church, right, is edification, right? We need to say things that edify each other. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. And most importantly of all, the words that come out of our mouth should bolster the idea that we are owned by Jesus Christ, right? That we are his. Everything that we do, everything that we say should be a testimony to the fact that I belong to Jesus Christ. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8, Colossians 3 verse 8, he says, but now you yourselves are to put off all of these, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Sounds familiar, right? Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds and have put on the new man who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him. And a little bit later is a verse that we read earlier, chapter 4, verse 6, to let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. You and I, as any of us here tonight who have put on Christ in baptism, we are no longer slaves to our emotions. We have a calling to put on this new man, right? The one that is renewed in knowledge according to the image of God. So with that said, and all these ideas that we've been talking about, and that scenario comes up and somebody does speak harshly to me right now, Stephen already gave us one good idea, but I want to hear from a couple other people. How best can I respond? Y'all teach me for a moment. If I'm in this scenario where somebody said something really hurtful to me, and I feel like I almost have to respond, maybe, the temptation would be good. How are ways that we could be training our mind to respond now so that when that situation arises, I'm more likely to handle that in a godly way? How can I respond to somebody? What are some practical things that we can be doing?
I think sometimes, especially when you're struggling to be, like, at least for me, like, sometimes I kind of freeze and I'm like, I don't even know what to say to that, But honestly, I think sometimes just sitting quietly makes them reflect on what just came out of their mouth. Like, if someone has said something caustic to you and you just kind of sit, it makes them like, well, what I meant to say was, or, because I think that silence sometimes speaks louder than even what you might say. Because my dad used to always tell me, it's better to be thought of as a fool than open your mouth and remove all that.
Right.
So it's like, I rather than respond to this in a way that I'm like, ooh, maybe that wasn't the best, I'm just going to sit here quietly and let you reflect on what you just said to me. And at least I know I handled that well by not saying anything. So.
I don't think anybody says that we had to respond right there in the moment, right? Absolutely not. I think that's a good one. Zach?
One is to just open up and ask them what the intention was of the statement. And don't yell at them or anything. Don't play the game. Take them out of the game right there. Take them out of that and be like, what was that statement intended to do? How was that? What did you intend by that? What did you mean by that? And it will turn the conversation on its head, because if it was spoken hastily on their end, suddenly they're backpedaling and they're going, ooh, that was definitely not a civil thing to do or say. And if there are, especially if there are observers watching and that kind of thing, you have saved face and you have really shown, hey, I'm not going to lash out at you. We're going to have a conversation. Or if they still refuse to do that, that's when you distance.
Okay. Brother Nelson?
Really, what Zach just said. I've worked in an industry for many years where I've gotten the opportunity to deal with clients who make complaints. And the most effective thing in diffusing the situation, repairing the relationship, often in strengthening the relationship, is to simply ask questions. Because it shows that you're listening. It shows that their opinion matters. This is hard to do, when it's someone who's close to you. It's a little easier to do when it's just a client. It's hard to do when it's someone that's closer to you, but just ask questions. Keep asking questions. Make sure that you understand. And you'll appear serious, and you'll appear concerned. And as Christians, maybe we should be. concern. Maybe that's the one opportunity we're going to get to try to have a positive influence in someone's life, is when they're being really negative towards us.
Absolutely. That's good advice. Thank you. I also thought of pausing before speaking, right? To be slow to speak, to leave some room there for those emotions to settle down, as Brother Stephen was saying, to pray for a gentle spirit. That is not something we think about doing when we're angry, right? But we can definitely take that to God in that moment and ask Him to take that anger away from us in that moment, that feeling. To be intentional in giving praise and encouragement to people, too. I think that's something that we maybe neglect sometimes because we get so caught up in the busyness of our lives. But to remind ourselves that we can be intentional in giving some praise and encouragement to people. Having that positive outlook on things and not letting things that may be negative to be static and stew in there. Brother Ryan, did you have something? Good.
Maybe not to put a negative spin on it, but after that, but I agree with you. But also knowing that there are just fools out there that you can appeal to logic, you can appeal to anything, and they're not going to get it. They're a fool. Like the Bible talks about that. And not putting your pearls before swine. You know, and not being surprised that they're acting the way they are just because the devil is who he is. And they are not a child of God. And don't be shocked when it's an irate customer that will not appeal to reason. You know, there's nothing you can do. You just have to maintain and be sinless yourself. You know.
Absolutely. All right, thank you. So my next thought with this is this idea of having a measure of control over what we say. And Brother Stephen worded it, I think, more eloquently than I ever could. But it's something that I do try to remind myself of, that we have a responsibility as children of God to be people who respond and not people who react. Right? Having a measure of control over our speech means that we think in terms of responding and not reacting. When I think of reaction, I think that this is instinctual. Or even habitual, right? It's a learned conditional response. But there's no forethought involved in that. It's just something I do. Responding, however, I mean that I take the time to measure my response, right? That I allow at some time for some little bit of wisdom to come here. Right? If I respond to a work email, is that not what I'm doing? Especially if my supervisor or upper management's involved in it or a client, I'm definitely going to take the time to make sure that my words don't make me look like a fool. Right? But the same thing should hold true of all of our speech, all of our conversations, right? We should allow that wisdom to manifest there, to respond and not to react in the moment. So that was the bell. So we're going to fast forward through a few things here. Words are powerful. We understand this. We have an obligation as God's children to use our words to glorify God, to avoid corrosive, biting tone in our language, to resist that urge to want to hurt somebody as we have been hurt, to be intentional with our words, and to consider, above all, to make sure that our words, the things that we let come out of our mouth, reflect that we have a heart of Christ. But also that in the moment when they don't, we should have enough wisdom to go in and really self-examine why that is the case. What kind of root of bitterness am I allowing to fester in there that's causing my speech to not be correct? And what can I do to root that out? I had a few thought questions. Maybe you guys can just take these with you in the last few moments. Ask yourself, what would people assume about your faith from the way that you speak? What if you were never able to share the gospel with them? What if they never knew about Jesus, but all they are ever going to determine about the gospel was based on the words that came out of your mouth at work or in public? What would people assume about your level of faith, about the power of the gospel, based on the things that we say on a day-to-day basis? Can you think of people who've been hurt by your words? And what can you do about it? It's kind of rhetorical. What can you do about it now? Of course nothing, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe I need to go back and revisit a conversation and apologize with somebody. But we need to consider the impact that our words have on people and how lasting it can be, and really consider responding and not reacting. And I'm just going to skip to the prayer prompt so I don't hold you guys over. Our prayer prompt for this week is from Psalms 141, verses 3 through 4. He says, "Set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth, and keep watch over the door of my lips. Do not incline my heart to any evil thing." This is something we can take with us and pray over this. Thank you guys so much for your participation tonight. I hope that this was edifying to you all as it was to me, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.